32, 35-ish on the line, or at least registered. So thank you for joining us. I'm Chris Rembold, Great Barrington Assistant Town Manager and Director of Planning and Community Development. So happy to have you here. I want to let you know that for folks who can't be here tonight, we are recording. So please know that your picture is being taken and your audio is being recorded. So just so you're aware. Tonight we'll review the town's environmental assessment work at 3 sites around Great Barrington, which we are doing thanks to a $300,000 fiscal year 2018 grant from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency through the Brownfields Assessment Program. The first site we'll discuss is in Housatonic, known as Cook's Garage, and the 2 others are in downtown Great Barrington, known as Reed Cleaners and the Carpenter's Variety site. So we'll review for you what we've learned at each site through the program and how the contamination at this site, all of these sites, influences the future of each site. And then at the end of the night, we'll have some time for your questions and maybe your thoughts about each site. I want to introduce quickly our Brownfields team, which includes Melissa Preventure, the Energy and Environmental Program Manager at Berkshire Regional Planning Commission. Hi, Melissa, thank you. She helps administer our Brownfields grants, not only this, but all of our Brownfields work, and helps us find the resources that we need to do the work. Also here tonight are Tom Bielsi and Nicole Hudson, both from TRC, and they are our environmental contractors doing the environmental assessment work. Tom is a senior project manager at TRC, and you'll hear mostly from him tonight. And then also want to acknowledge and welcome Madison Biazin, our planning department intern, who's helped coordinate some of the information for tonight. So, and I want to mention also before we get started that because of the complexity of brownfield work, the town relies heavily on partnerships with agencies like the Berkshire Regional Planning Commission, also the Environmental Protection Agency, and also Mass DEP, Mass Development. So we're all sort of working together to get our hands around these issues. So thank you all. And then before we jump into the sites, I just thought it would be helpful to explain a little bit of background of how we got here and what a brownfield is. So first, what's a brownfield? When we say brownfield, we're referring to a property whose development or reuse is complicated in some way by the presence or the potential presence of a hazardous substance or a pollutant or a contaminant of some kind. So our goal under this EPA grant is to identify brownfield sites and then assess them so we can understand how those contamination issues, if any, are impacting the site, and then work to mitigate those issues so that these properties, these sites can be transitioned in some way to meet the community's needs, to contribute to the local economy, et cetera. So the current work under the EPA grant focuses on 3 sites: Cook's Garage, Reed Cleaners, and Carpenter's Variety. And we're focused on those sites because the town either controls those, we own them, and they're prominent sites whose cleanup, if we can accomplish that, whether by us or a private entity, could be beneficial to the community in some way. So without this cooperative federal and town initiative, the sites would just continue to languish even longer because of the contamination issues. And because the property owners, the private owners, potential owners, have limited resources or concerns about the liability on each site. So, without further ado, well, let's jump into each site. I'll give a quick overview of each one, and then I'll ask Tom to summarize the environmental situation of each one. So I'll share my screen briefly so you can just see where the first site is, and that's Cook's Garage. So hopefully everybody can see this image of the village of Housatonic. You can see Cook's Garage down here on the lower portion of the screen. It's part of the old Monument Mills complex. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. It's kind of landlocked there. You see it tucked right in against the east side of the Houstonic River. It's next to the old Barbieri lumber site. It's here just north of the Park Street Bridge. So this is the site that we'll be discussing first. And I'll turn it over to Tom now, and he can give you a little bit of background on the work that we did there.
Thanks, Chris. Well, good evening, everyone. As Chris mentioned, my name is Tom Biolsi. I'm with TRC Environmental. So to summarize the environmental work that our firm has done under contract with the town, the first thing that we did, as typical of the three sites that we're talking about, this site, the environmental conditions was the least known. So one of the first things that are typically done, as was done here, is what's called a phase one assessment. It's an assessment that's done according to a national standard. And so we did this soon after the town acquired the property in 2018. We finished the phase one in September of 2018. The purpose of the phase one is to identify what's called a recognized environmental condition. Basically, it's anything that is documented or may present an environmental concern. So it's an information gathering exercise, researching historical documents, historical databases of any known releases of hazardous substances or petroleum products, talking to folks who have knowledge of the property and its former uses, going to the property, putting eyes to the property, the buildings, the land, taking some pictures, combining all that and evaluating, are there any environmental concerns? And if there are, what are they? So for this particular one, as Chris mentioned, this it was former, related to part of the Monument Mills complex. So it has a rich history dating back approximately 100 years of former textile mill. And then it was historically used as a lumber yard and some other uses. There was information that the site may have been used as a gas station at one point in time. There were records that there were 4 underground storage tanks that were removed, but not that much information available with that. So the one recognized environmental condition was based upon the former historic use of the property, unknown conditions of the tanks, whether there may be additional tanks that may be located on the property. So one of the items that we did under the town's grant was perform a geophysical survey. That's essentially using instruments to kind of look in the ground using different techniques that would identify potential items that might be buried in the ground, typically drums or tanks. And there weren't any strong indications that there might be a tank, except for 2 locations called anomaly, 2 things of concern. Geophysical surveys don't identify specific what's in the ground, just something that might be something of concern. So there were 2 areas. Chris, I don't know if you mind if you can display the site plan for the Cook's Garage site.
Sure. Can you see that, Tom?
Yep, I can see it. Thanks.
Okay.
So here's a little close-up of the Cook's Garage property outlined in red. And those 2 yellow rectangles indicate 2 areas where there were anomalies identified by the geophysical survey where we dug a test pit, basically digging a hole where there was an anomaly to see what it was. It wasn't any tanks. It was this change in geology. Some of this, it can differentiate between different types of soil quality if something had been dug up and then put back. So it could have been relics of where a couple of the former underground storage tanks used to be. So it was good news. There were no underground storage tanks that were found by the survey. The 4 magenta rectangles that are indicated on this figure are former locations of 4 above ground storage tanks, heating oil size, roughly 275 gallons. So as part of the program, removal of the the above ground storage tanks, we hired a contractor. Those were cleaned out and removed off site and disposed of properly. We also collected soil samples, and those are indicated by the blue circles on this figure. That's involved in hiring a drilling firm to drill holes in the ground, and we collect environmental samples and submit them to an accredited laboratory under an approved plan, approved by EPA. And the soil samples did not indicate any constituents above thresholds that would need to be reported to Mass DEP. The Mass DEP is the lead regulatory agency for all three of these sites that we're discussing. With one exception, it's a little hard to see. Chris, you may be able to zoom in on that pit right there. Well, the indication of a pit. So right there, there's a pit that's located inside the building. It was roughly 2 foot by 4 foot square hole that had been cut in the concrete floor, had a metal plate on it. We collected a soil sample from there, and it did show a couple contaminants of metal, a couple metals. But as allowed under the state regulatory program, if you can address contaminants, basically remove them so they're not a concern within a certain period of time, it doesn't need to be reported to Mass DEP. So as Chris mentioned about partnerships, working hand in hand with Melissa at Berkshire Regional Planning Commission and the Environmental Protection Agency, we use revolving loan funds, which is also funded by EPA, which is typically used for cleanup, which is what we wanted to do, is get rid of the soil in the pit that had the elevated concentrations of metals. So we were able to do that in a quick amount of time within the time frame as allowed under state regulations, remove that off-site properly, and backfilled it and compacted it with gravel up to the surrounding interior concrete grade. So in the end, the assessment was complete, and there was a little bit of cleanup, as I mentioned, removing the soil from the pit, and that was successfully completed. Another item that we did was perform a hazardous building material survey to quantify if any of the building materials contain any hazardous materials, such as asbestos or lead paint or PCBs. As typical for mill buildings of this age, they typically do contain asbestos, and this one's no exception. It was about 6 different types of building materials that contained asbestos. Did not contain any PCBs that would trigger any reporting or any immediate removal. So moving forward, based upon the environmental activities that were performed, no additional activities, assessment, or cleanup activities are warranted at this property. There is a well on this property that formerly was used, if you can see Chris's cursor in that area. The exact location is unknown because it's reportedly probably under the concrete slab, the building slab, so you can't physically put eyes to it. But based on historical documents reviewed, it appears that it's in that general location. It had once been used to fill swimming pools, one of the former operations. So there's some additional investigation that would be needed to, characterize the water if that was intended to be used. Based upon the state's regulatory program, it's not likely it could be used for potable uses in the future, but it could potentially be used for other uses, potentially for irrigation or things of that nature. Additional activities that would be warranted to facilitate development would be to remove the asbestos that was identified through the building materials survey. And this site, is posed, it could be used for, industrial, commercial, or residential uses. depending upon the specific intended reuse, if the developer was interested in using this for what the state considers a sensitive use, such as a school or daycare or something where children are present in direct contact with environmental media, then some additional evaluation may be warranted, particularly for areas that hadn't been investigated prior.
Great.
I think that pretty much summarizes Cook's Garage, Chris.
Thanks, Tom. So we know a lot about Cook's Garage thanks to this program. That when the town took ownership in 2018, and by the way, the town still owns it. We didn't know all of this, so we feel we've now thoroughly assessed it, and at least we have our hands around the contamination issues, what was there or what is currently there, for example, in the form of the asbestos and hazardous building materials survey. That well water is another sort of interesting factor. The building also shares walls with 420 Park Street, which is the Reuben Mill. So there are other maybe structural issues with the building. And then of course, market issues and what's feasible in this current marketplace. Those are things that we'll have to wrap our heads around before we decide as a town through the select board how best to move forward with this site. But this is a site that we own and we know a lot about. So anyway, I think at this point, I'll ask folks if you have questions pertaining to this site specifically, just to hold them so we can go through each site. Because I think some of the questions may be more global. We'll address those. We'll have time at the end to address all of those. So I'm just going to stop this share. Let some other folks into the room. So just a reminder, we'll be talking about Cook's Garage, Reed Cleaners, and Carpenters variety. Hold your questions till the end. We'll leave some time to chat. So I'm going to just share my screen again and show you the Reed Cleaners location. So this is the next site we'll talk about. Reed Cleaners is here outlined in yellow downtown in Great Barrington, just south of Roster Street in Salisbury, sort of sandwiched between the Salisbury Bank and the post office, across from the library and St. Peter's Catholic Church. This is a former dry cleaners where the Reed family, as well as an abutter, had done a good bit of environmental assessment work after the dry cleaning business closed and before the town stepped in. The town took the site in 2019 for back taxes, and we still own this site as well as Cook's Garage. And in fact, we were able to secure grant funds to help with the cleanup of this site, which is great. And the EPA has been extremely helpful with cleanup funding and doing some remediation work themselves to supplement what we've done. And amazingly, we also are getting soon some additional market research information using a cooperative work plan through EPA. So hopefully soon we'll have more information on what is marketable at this site as well. But I digress a little bit. I'll let Tom talk about the environmental issues that we have encountered and what's next relative to cleanup at Reed Cleaners.
Thanks, Chris. So for this particular property, there had been more environmental investigations done. So beginning in approximately 2008, when Chris, if you don't mind sharing the site figure, it'd probably be best to start off with that. Sure. There's a lot to talk about with this property.
Okay, see that?
Yes.
Great.
So just as a point of reference, again, the property itself is outlined in red. The area that's outlined in purple is the area of the former dry cleaning building. And as Chris mentioned, this is the area that EPA has recently performed a cleanup soil removal action just a few months ago in May. So the property itself is, most of you are probably aware, there's one existing building that fronts Main Street. That was more the retail operations of the dry cleaner. The building that's no longer there in the back, again, depicted by the purple rectangle, was the former building of where the dry cleaning operations actually took place. So that's the location where the majority of the contamination was found. It was found, the site used to contain 4 underground storage tanks, reportedly 2 of which contain the typical dry cleaning solvent, tetrachloroethylene, or its acronym PCE, sometimes referred to as PERC. The other 2 underground storage tanks contained heating oil. Also, there was another reported above ground storage tank of the dry cleaning solvent PCE, again within the former building footprint. So as I mentioned, there were a series of environmental investigations that were initiated when the building was demolished in 2008. It was discovered that there were those underground storage tanks. When they were removed, reportedly all of them had holes in them, which obviously unfortunately facilitated the release of its contents, the dry cleaning solvent and the petroleum from heating oil. It appeared that it went into the former floor drains of the building. There were a number of soil samples collected. There were a number of environmental samples collected from within the existing building, indoor air samples, sub-slab samples, meaning the collection of air that accumulates underneath building slabs. There were also slab and indoor air samples collected from adjacent buildings. The post office to the south, the 3 structures to the north, which is currently Salisbury Bank, and then the church at 9 Rossiter and the mixed use building at 11 Rossiter. And also there was investigations at the church across Main Street as well. So there were a lot of investigations performed, and as I mentioned, the primary contaminants, the source area where most of this started was in that magenta box, which is why EPA recently just completed soil removal action just a few months ago in May. What's also depicted on this figure is a blue arrow, generally pretty much right in the middle of the site figure. That's indicating the direction of groundwater flow. The symbols that are indicated in blue and black, a circle with a pattern, those indicate the locations of a groundwater monitoring well. There were roughly about 24 groundwater monitoring wells. A lot of them on the property itself, and others, as you can see, scattered across a variety of properties surrounding it to try and delineate or find out where the contaminants went in groundwater, traveled in groundwater, and where they stop, in a sense, where they're not above regulatory standards anymore. So through a variety of investigations that our firm performed on behalf of the town, we collected a variety of soil and groundwater samples and indoor air and subslab samples beginning in 2015 under a mass development grant, and then continued work under the town's current assessment grant. Back in 2015, let's see, there's a well, I realize I can't use my cursor to point, but on the intersection of Main Street and Dresser Avenue, essentially at the corner of the parking lot area right there. In 2015, when that was sampled, it was just above the state's threshold for chlorinated solvents. When we retested that well and installed another well further down in the direction of groundwater flow, thanks, Chris, at that location closer to the library, those 2 locations came up below the state standards for the dry cleaning solvent, meaning that we had delineated the extent of contamination in the shallow groundwater. In the former source area, again, where the building used to be, we also installed a well deeper in bedrock. Chlorinated solvents is a chemical that has a density greater than water. So unlike oil, as most know, that will float on the water surface, chlorinated solvents sink in the water column. So we installed a deeper well. In addition to performing collection of variety of samples from within soil and groundwater and indoor air, we also, similar to Cook's Garage, conducted a hazardous building material survey of the existing building. Much smaller building, but there was some asbestos that was identified. Similar to Cook's Garage, PCBs were not identified above the threshold that required removal or to address. So moving forward, the redevelopment plans for this property, we need to address the hazardous building materials in that site building, whether the building itself is demolished or whether it's renovated. The hazardous materials would need to be abated. The additional actions with regard to groundwater, the deeper groundwater would need to be further assessed. As I mentioned, there was one deeper well that we installed under the town's brownfield assessment program, and that did come up above the state's standard, so meaning that the deeper groundwater is contaminated on the site itself. Now, the groundwater use, there are no private drinking water wells within the vicinity here. So the drinking of the groundwater here is not a concern or affect the community. Where groundwater is most of a concern for situations like this is whether it may impact indoor air. But as I mentioned, there's been quite a few rounds of indoor air testing of the site building itself, which will need to be addressed when that building is either demolished or renovated. And there's proven technologies that are routinely used that can be either retrofitted to this building or as part of new construction to mitigate any contaminated vapors to indoor air. The 3 buildings to the north that I mentioned that indoor air samples were collected, the bank and 9 and 11 Rossiter Street, the indoor air is not impacted at any of those 3 locations, and they were sampled multiple times. Let's see. And I believe there's ongoing investigations and evaluation at the post office. The work that we have done and continuing are doing under the town's brownfields assessment grant, we can't address another government-owned property, so we haven't done any. They're not allowed to do any assessment. There's separate investigations that are being done at the post office. And I think I touched upon everything for that property. Obviously, if anyone has any questions, I guess we'll address that after providing a brief summary of the final site that we're going to discuss.
Thanks, Tom. So just a quick sum up with Reed Cleaners. So we're talking about a dry cleaning solvent, which was mostly back here in this part of the site. We're hoping that the recent EPA action, which was to remove a lot of contaminated soil back there, is successful in removing all of the source material that was contaminated, and that has over the years continued to contaminate the groundwater in the area. We're awaiting a report from EPA's folks on that, and that will help shape our cleanup actions going forward at this site. So again, we have a cleanup grant for this site, and we'll tailor what we need to do based on what we learned from EPA's recent work there. And just briefly to touch on the good news is we know that air quality in like Salisbury Bank, for example, is not being impacted. We know that the library across the street and the church across the street are not being impacted. While the post office basement is being impacted with indoor air quality issues from the contaminant, that's not a public space. and the post office manages their employees there in order to minimize any issues there. So anyway, with reed cleaners, we know a lot about it now, and we have some funds in place to move this project forward. 5 years ago at this time, and you would have asked me about reed cleaners, it was sort of a black hole. We didn't know enough about it. And despite a lot of interest in purchasing and redeveloping the site, everybody walked away because of the unknowns. So now we're starting to put a box around those unknowns, and hopefully we have some resources to move forward. So, and finally tonight, we'll talk about Carpenter's Variety, which is another downtown site. So here's Reed's we were just talking about. Carpenter's Variety is further down Main Street. It's this box here outlined in yellow. It's 347 Main Street. And we call it Carpenter's Variety because that's what it was when the contamination issues first came to light in, I want to say, the 1980s. Tom, correct me if I'm wrong. People may also know Carpenter's Variety as the Deli, or as Wagafers, or as Hong Kong Buffet. It's been a number of things over the years. So it sits right here, kind of across from Town Hall and St. James Place, and next to BCC. This is the Dewey Academy, the former Dewey Academy, the Searles Castle property. So this is the site here. It's relatively small. It's the site of a former gas station, which and those are the contamination issues. Unlike Cook's Garage and Reed Cleaners, the town does not own Carpenter's Variety. We have tax liens for back taxes on the site, but we don't yet own this site. So our options at this point are more limited, but the good thing about this assessment program is we know a heck of a lot more than we did before we started with this. And even though EPA and the owners back in the 80s, 90s, and for a decade or two had been doing a lot of work, assessment work, that assessment work languished. And we were able to resurrect some of that and see what the current conditions were. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to Tom, and you can talk about the environmental issues there.
Okay, thanks, Chris. If you don't mind showing the site plan for that property.
Sure.
So as Chris mentioned, the environmental issues came to light back in 1986. As Chris mentioned, one of the former uses of this property was a gas station. As you can see up in the upper portion of the figure, again, similar to the other site figures, the property is outlined in red. And near the street were the locations of 4 former gasoline underground storage tanks. And when those were removed in 1986, those had holes in them upon removal, and it was discovered that there was significant release of gasoline to the ground when they were removed. So that prompted a variety and a number of environmental investigations beginning in the 80s, in 86. And it went very quickly from assessment to remediation. A lot of this was driven by the state, by Mass DEP. There were recovery systems put in place starting in March of 87. Recovery system in this case meaning a larger hole, recovery well dug in the ground at a couple locations to collect the floating gasoline at the time that was on the water surface. So at this particular property, when a hole was dug, where a typical monitoring well, when you dig a hole, you'll put a PVC pipe in the ground with very small slots in it to allow water to accumulate in the pipe, but not soil or sediment. And that allows the collection and sampling of the groundwater. In this case, when that was done, it was discovered that gasoline was floating on the water surface. At one point, early back in the late 80s, it was up to 5 feet thick. So it became apparent that something immediate needed to be done. So 2 recovery wells were first installed, and then less than a year later, a few more were dug. And then another recovery system was installed further down gradient. When I mention down gradient, that means the direction of groundwater flow. As you can see roughly in the center of this figure, there's a cyan arrow indicating the direction of the flow of groundwater. And why that's important, because the contaminants were released from the underground storage tanks to the groundwater table, and then the groundwater carries the contaminants in the direction of the flow of groundwater, which is why you can see all these symbols that are shown on here, some of which are highlighted in yellow, which I'll get to in a moment, and others that are not, are the locations of the groundwater monitoring wells. There were a lot of others I mentioned. There were recovery wells, interceptor trenches, meaning kind of the direction of the groundwater flow, digging a trench perpendicular to that to intercept the gasoline so it doesn't go any further. There were a lot of other things that were done on this property over the last several decades that are not indicated on this figure, because it would just be too difficult to see. The other symbols on this figure, just so you know, the black squares indicate the locations of the the indoor air samples that were collected inside the existing Berkshire Community College building, and also at the former Dewey Academy, the cursor is right now. And then the triangles are where a subslab air sample was collected. As I had mentioned at the Reed Cleaner site, it's a collection of air that accumulates underneath actually any impervious surface, not just buildings. You can collect, air sample underneath an asphalt parking lot, anything that restricts air from going up to the atmosphere. So as Chris mentioned, the work that we recently completed under the town's grant was to get an idea of what is the current condition of the property. What are the contaminant concentrations look like? Because there was a large gap in assessment from 2010 up until a couple years ago where nothing was done because of lack of funding. As Chris mentioned, that this is, of the 3 sites, this site the town does not currently own. So there were sporadic times throughout its environmental history where there was a lot of activity that was done earlier on, and then there was time when there was no assessment or cleanup being performed. But when the recovery systems and the treatment systems, they were operating for a number of years, and then at the time, it was the concentrations in groundwater were going down. The gasoline that I had mentioned before that was floating on the water surface, the thicknesses were going down, and then there was no measurable gasoline on the water surface anymore. So that the recovery and treatment systems were working, and throughout treatment system operation, there's constant monitoring of groundwater. There was monitoring of indoor air in the academy building, and it was determined at some time to deactivate the treatment systems because they had done what they were intended to do. But then back in the early 2000s, when monitoring was continued, it was noticing that some of the concentrations were climbing back up. So when we started work under the town's grant, first we wanted to find out, well, how many monitoring wells are still on the property, are still in existence? So that's what this figure shows. This figure, all the yellow and the unhighlighted wells are all the wells that were found. The ones that are highlighted in yellow are the ones that we collected a groundwater sample from. Because the town's assessment funding is not unlimited funds, and this is one of 3 sites that we wanted to assess, under close coordination with Chris, the EPA, Berkshire Regional Planning Commission, deciding where the best use of funds. So this property was decided to sample roughly half of the wells that were found to find out, some within where the underground storage tanks used to be, and some at the very end, and a few wells in between. The other symbol on this figure up toward the Berkshire Community College building, the wells that have a purple ring around them, circle around them, those are where the groundwater samples that currently have petroleum contamination above the state standards are found, are located. So the other wells that are highlighted in yellow that were sampled, when we sampled them, did not indicate concentrations of petroleum above the state standard. So it appears that the highest concentrations were near the Berkshire Community College building. So whenever you have a contaminant such as gasoline, a contaminant that's considered volatile, meaning, essentially maybe an easy way to think about it is something you can smell that may affect indoor air, we immediately went to recommending and performing indoor air sampling and the subsite sampling of the Berkshire Community College building. And as most of you may or may not know, Berkshire Community College operates the top floor of the building and then leases out the bottom floor to two tenants, Elements Independent Jewelry Maker and CHP, a dental office. So we collected indoor air samples at all three tenant spaces and subslab locations in all three tenant locations as well. What was unexpectedly found in the indoor air was a dry cleaning solvent, tetrachloroethylene. Through a variety of investigations and inventory of chemicals that every tenant used, any subcontracting cleaning firms, additional considerations because this was happening at the onset of the COVID pandemic. It was determined that the concentrations of the chlorinated solvent was not originating from the ground, that it was from a use of a chemical inside the building. In addition, petroleum, it was identified in the indoor air in one of the spaces, but it was not identified in the subslab air, again indicating that that was not coming from the subsurface. So kind of the good news is that although the indoor air quality at a couple locations were triggered that something may need to be done, it was an artifact of chemicals or products that were used within the building and not currently a function of the former release from the former gas station, the Carpenter's Variety. So where do we go from here? As Chris mentioned, the town doesn't currently own this, but there is an interested developer looking at the Berkshire Community College building. As far as the Carpenter's Variety, a building materials survey is recommended to be performed. Should that building, should the redevelopment plans either include renovation of that structure or demolition of the structure, you would need to quantify if there's any hazardous building materials before that would occur, which is typical for pretty much any redevelopment plan. Some further assessment of the contamination in groundwater is warranted because, as I mentioned, right now it's showing based upon the round of groundwater samples that we collected, the contaminants appear to be concentrated near where the former tanks used to be. So, it may suggest maybe some additional removal action might be warranted to decrease the concentrations of petroleum in groundwater. And I think, and also in then continuing the response actions as, because this has a long environmental history and it's been in the state's regulatory program, the Massachusetts Contingency Plan, any additional response actions would need to be followed in accordance with those regulations. So
Thanks, Tom.
I think I've covered everything for this site.
Great. Great, thanks. Thanks everybody for hanging in there. It gets a little technical, but it's important for you to understand what we found and how that impacts the site and what the town can or can't do about it, how it might be developed, how it could serve the community, what resources the town can and can't bring to the table. Thank you for sticking with us through all of that. So I'd like to open it up for questions, comments, your thoughts about each site. We can take each one in turn. We can sort of pepper around the room. I just ask you to raise your hand. Use the raise your hand feature on the Zoom platform towards the bottom of your screen. I think it's on the bottom of your screen, right? I hope. And if you're by phone, I think it's *9 to raise your hand. So raise your hand and I'll call on you, and Tom or Melissa or Nicole or I will try to answer your questions. So let's see, Barbara, you can unmute yourself and go ahead. Oh, it's John.
It's actually both of us.
Hi, thanks for joining us.
In terms of Cook's Garage, I've heard it's unsubstantiated, but I've heard Dale Culleton owns half a 50% interest in the well. Is that still existent, or does the town's taking make that go away?
The abutting property owner at Cook's Garage in Houstonic, yes, owns 50% of the rights to that well. That doesn't go away because the town is now the owner of Cook's Garage. So it's in the deed because this was all part of the Monument Mills complex. When they split up these two particular properties, they wrote right in the deed that the two properties get 50% rights to the well water.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, everybody wants to be asleep. Go ahead, Pedro.
Yeah, hi. So I've heard talk at Reed Cleaners about a plume of stuff. So what about the plume?
I can address that if you want, Chris.
Yeah, great. Go ahead, Tom. I mean, the short answer is we know in shallow groundwater where this is. Tom, you can elaborate.
Sure. So in the environmental industry, plume as a general connotation of contaminants in groundwater. And yes, there is a plume. So this, in that particular case, for Reed Cleaners, the chlorinated solvents and a lesser concern, petroleum, got into the shallow groundwater, the groundwater at the property and under the property. And the plume did extend beyond the property boundaries. And that's why that site figure showed a lot of the symbols indicating the locations of groundwater monitoring wells at a variety of properties beyond the Reed Cleaners property. But as I mentioned, we did find the end to that plume. So it doesn't extend past Main Street. So in 2015, we had one well on the corner of Dresser Avenue and Main Street that showed concentrations just above the standard. And then in 2019, I believe it is, I checked the date, we resampled that well and installed another well closer to the library, and they were below standard. So the plume does not extend to the library. And Chris mentioned the church just to the north across the street from Reed Cleaners. Indoor air was tested, and the indoor air was fine at that property as well. So the plume doesn't extend. It's confined to the Reed Cleaners property, the post office, and probably a bit under Main Street. And then also to the properties to the north, at least for, it looks like probably under the bank as well. But again, since no one's drinking that water there, the concern would be, is it affecting indoor air? and indoor air was tested at the bank, and 9 and 11 Rossiter, and indoor air is not impacted. I don't know if that answered your question. Okay.
Thanks, Pedro. Let's see, Jenny Clark, go ahead.
Hi. I had heard tell also, this is all hearsay, or maybe it was something written, that runoff water from Reed's Cleaner was infecting the river and was attaching itself to the banks of the river and creating a dust that was was infecting the air. Is that, where are we on that? Is there any indication of that still? No.
I can address that, Chris, if you like.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Tom.
Based upon the research that we've done, again, based upon the environmental samples that were collected by others beginning in 2008, up through the work that we've performed, it does not suggest that the contaminants from the Reed cleaners have reached the river. So as I mentioned, it's not reaching the library, which is diagonally across the street, and it can't kind of jump properties. You would see a natural progression of higher concentrations to lower, and eventually where it's not detected. And the not detected is at the library.
Nor is it in surface water runoff. It's, if runoff comes off of the pavement of Reed cleaners, the contaminant was in the ground, specifically in the soil that EPA has now removed, and below ground surface. So it wasn't being washed off into the storm sewers and then directly into the river. That was not the case at Reed cleaners.
And actually, as part of the work that we performed under the Mass Development Grant back in 2015, we actually did sample some of the sediment and surface water, if there were any, in a couple of the catch basins around the site. And I think they were indicated on the site plan, and that didn't show anything of concern.
So not a concern, Jenny. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much.
Yep. Anybody else? We have Lee. Go ahead.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you very much. This was very helpful. Question, you mentioned a feasibility study that we're going to be doing, or we'll be getting on Reed Cleaners, a marketing study. So just wondering when we expect that and what is that going to cover?
Yeah, good question. So EPA, thanks again to US EPA, was able to take advantage of a larger service contract they have with consultants, in this case, market research consultant, and brought them on board to look at Reed cleaners specifically and to look at the site, to examine it in the context of the downtown business environment, to look at area demographics and what other stores and industries are in the area, represented here or not represented here, and take all of that data and give us some idea of what might be a feasible uses or set of uses on that site, and in order to meet market demand, or what might be feasible to develop based on the site conditions. So we have another call with them, I think, in a week or two. So I know they are well underway, and I'm hopeful we get a report by, I want to say the end of August. Don't quote me on that, but it's soon. And hopefully that will give us some idea of, what uses we can attract or should try to attract to that site.
Thank you. So as a follow-up question, is it possible to get them to expand this to the Carpenter's Variety site since within the general area?
Yeah, unfortunately, the program was a little bit limited, and I think we benefited because the town owns Reeds and we can control what happens there. EPA was able to bring that technical and market research to bear. Carpenters is still kind of in play in terms of ownership and what would happen there. We can influence it less. So no, I don't think we can. I'll ask the question, but I don't think we can. In any case, hopefully when the report comes out, it's useful both for the town and the select board for determining how to move forward, but also, it can hopefully become useful for an interested party if the town decides to part ways with Reed Cleaners.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just had one last question, if I may. The air quality that was detected where CHP was is a concern. Do we have any sense of if that impacted any families or how bad that was?
So this question is relative to the Carpenter's Variety site next to BCC, and CHP has a dental office in the lower floor of the BCC building. Tom, if you could maybe answer that question. I know you did supervise the work there, so.
Sure. No, it was determined that was due not to the contaminants from the Carpenter's Variety building. So it was due to something that was used within the building itself. So when the identification of that material or chemical was used, when that's not used anymore, then the concentration is expected to decrease.
Thank you very much.
So it's not a persistent condition. Once that chemical's not used, no impact to the folks in that space.
Thank you.
Chris, this is Ian. I'm sorry, I don't know how to raise my hand.
I saw a thumbs up a lot. I wasn't sure what that was.
I so appreciate what you're saying, so I'm just thumbing you up constantly.
Go ahead.
Question on Carpenter's Variety. What's the timeline for the town on doing any further assessment? I'm assuming the EPA funds are not in place yet to do further assessment work there. Is that correct?
That's correct. We don't have any more funds to continue work under this assessment program at any of these sites. So we're closing out that grant now. It's possible that we could find more assessment money, but it's not imminent. Very competitive program. It wouldn't be anytime soon. Sorry to say.
Thank you.
Nan.
Hi, Chris and Tom and everyone else. I have a really elementary question, and I'm sure it can be answered very simply because you keep referring to the EPA, but it's the DEP that has a website that posts all of the remedial monitoring reports and the site visit dates, et cetera, and pictures and all that stuff. So differentiate for me how the DEP and the EPA are working with the town.
Yeah, good question.
The roles they play.
Okay, yeah, good question. Mass DEP, so the State Department of Environmental Protection, is the regulatory agency here. So they're going to be collecting all of the data that's produced. They're going to post it on their website for public knowledge. And it's the Mass DEP who will determine where the site is in terms of environmental compliance with different contaminants, what the levels are, and what actions might need to be taken to reduce that contamination. In this case, so that's Mass DEP as the regulatory side. In this case, EPA is our partner in terms of bringing funding, so we can do the assessment work, so we can do the cleanup work, which is all done in accordance with Mass DEP standards. So they're playing two slightly different roles, but we're all working together. Tom, is that a good answer?
Yes, that is. I think just to expand upon that maybe slightly. So for the work that's funded by EPA, the brownfields assessment work, any work that was done, EPA reviews and approves our work plan before we actually do the work. But it's Mass DEP ultimately that will decide on basically what's clean is clean. And I put that in air quotes. We're comparing the standards of whatever media that's being collected, whether it's soil or groundwater or air samples. They're being compared to the state standards because this is the state regulatory program which governs the cleanup of the properties. But because it's money, in this case, as Chris mentioned, money from the EPA, they are involved in, approving according with their standards of the work plan. Saying it's being done in accordance with industry standards. Yes, you're using an accredited laboratory. Yes, you're comparing the methods that are being used are appropriate, and so on and so forth. I'm not sure if did that answer your question, or did I complicate or confuse the issue?
Oh, you're muted, Nan.
No, that's fine. That's what I wanted to know. And thank you both.
Great.
Okay.
That's it.
Great, thanks. Lee, go ahead.
Are you able to tell us how much of a tax lien the Carpenter's Variety has right now? I'm assuming that if we didn't feel like we had a good chance of acquiring this property, we wouldn't have spent the money to do this.
I don't have that figure in front of you. I do believe that the town has moved forward with a foreclosure action. I can't tell you how long that will take. It goes through state land court.
But we have started to move forward with foreclosure. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments about the sites? Things we should keep in mind for future cleanup work, or things you think the town and select board and planning board should keep in mind as we're thinking about next steps for any of these sites? Please feel free to let us know. Go ahead, Nan.
Yeah, here I am. I'm back. Can you just clarify for me what has the removal of contaminants at Reed Cleaners been completed and they've carted all that stuff away, or is there more sub-slab depressurization work to be done, or whatever?
The short answer is that we believe all of the contaminated soil in the location of the former tanks that leaked out back, we believe all that contaminated soil has been removed. So as EPA was digging, they basically sampled as they dug to see, okay, still contaminated, still dig. When they reached the point of no more contamination, they stopped digging. So they feel like, I think got all of the soil out, and we're awaiting that report. But if there's still contamination that leached into groundwater, that may still exist. So it may still impact groundwater, certainly indoor air inside the building. Tom, is that a good and clear answer?
Yeah. And so you have a schedule of more testing going on throughout the year, throughout eternity? I mean,
we will determine what we need to do. Once we see that report from EPA's cleanup folks, that'll give us a sense of what we need to do to what else needs to be cleaned up and how and when. Tom, go ahead.
No, just nodding in concurrence. And then just as a reminder, as you mentioned before, Chris, that you already have an EPA cleanup grant, to further assist with future response actions, cleanup actions at the property.
Yep.
So once EPA's report is received and reviewed, you can decide on what the best course of action is to spend the cleanup grant.
Yep. Okay, Nan?
Okay.
Okay, go ahead, Lee.
Thank you, Chris. Coming to Cook's Garage, it might be helpful to have some market research done on Cook's Garage if you are going to be having that conversation. And I realize that's, a stretch, but it would be nice to have some guidance on, from a market perspective, some of the uses that would be helpful for that site. So just throwing that out there if that's a possibility.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, comments or questions? Well, thanks everybody for sticking with us. One of the benefits of asking you to register for the meeting is we now have all your email addresses. So we can send you updates if you'd like. We do have some brief fact sheets on each property, which we can send out after the meeting closes. And then if you have any other questions, feel free to email us, email me or call me. And hopefully we can give you some answers. So anyway, thanks, Tom. Thanks, Melissa and Nicole. And special thanks to US EPA and DEP and all our partners who help us with this really complicated work. So it takes a long time, but in these cases, there's a lot of resources and different issues that need to be resources gathered and issues discussed and analyzed. So yeah, we're working diligently on each site. Well, thank you very much. And let us know if you have any questions. Have a great night.
Thank you. Great job.